instantly. This improves your code to the point where you can just work around this and immediately solve this so that it doesn't go through each and every condition. So if I write, let's say 305, you can see loan is provided based on scrutiny and collateral, which is going over here for reference. Anyway, moving ahead over to the next part. This is the basic idea of if, elif, and else. It's just a ladder of if and else conditions that we are using in our simple case. And this is something we're going to use a lot when we combine with these operations. Again, we're going to start looking at these operators in detail when we start looking at data structures. It doesn't make much sense to directly learn certain operators without learning data structures in detail. So that's going to be our first priority to work on. Now, before we go ahead, I'll just be on mute maybe for a few seconds. I'll just be back. Kindly hold on. Right, so sorry for the slight delay. Moving back to this, let's continue ahead. Now, back to the point of this. Let's continue ahead from these if and else constructs over to loops. Python supports two kind of looping constructs. Those are particularly for and while. There's no do um, while loop within Python. It does not exist. It's just for and while specifically. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. Again, once we're done with that, once we're done with our constructs and some basic operations, that's when we will be going ahead to the major part of this, which is data structures. And that's going to be the key part that we will focus on. But anyway, let's go ahead for now with this. So whenever you want to walk through an iterable, whenever you want to loop through any iterable, you can just use a for loop. It's not necessary to use while for looping through an iterable. While has its own conditions and purpose, which we'll see further. But most of the time, whenever you want to just loop through an iterable, you can use for loop. And I'm just going to show you how that works in this. Let's say there's an iterable of a string like this. Monday with an exclamation. Of course, agreed, nobody wants to put an exclamation ahead of Monday. It's not exciting, but let's consider this particular string. At this point, all that I want to add here is just a simple loop. I want to go through every single character of this string. If you want to go through each character of the string called Monday, all you have to do is for in. You just have to use these two specific keywords. That's it. For what do you want to name each character when you go through it? I can name each character as just character. Let's name it as character. For each character in what? in an iterable. What's the name of the iterable? Let's consider it as S1. We'll just specify S1. So all you need to do is to go through every single character of an iterable, just specify for whatever is that character within that iterable. That's enough. You can walk through all the characters within that iterable entirely. That's the whole purpose. I can just write for, let's create a string first for this purpose. S1 is, let's say, Monday, and I'm just going to write for character. Again, you can name this anything you want in S1, and I'm just going to print that character for now. Again, we're going to use in operator for various different cases ahead, which I'll talk about. But let's start with this to begin with. If you take a look at this, okay, I'm gonna do one little task. I'll comment all these lines of code for now. But when you receive this file, you just have to select all of them. Just press Control and slash. It'll just uncomment. So it's that simple. We don't have to worry much about it, just for our reference. But yeah, let's get back to this. S1 has a value Monday, and I want to go through each character of it. So all I need to do is here, just specify for character in S1. If I print the character, it just goes through each character and prints it. Now remember, by default, after each print statement, or in other words, by default, each time you go through a print statement, it ends with a new line character. Each print statement is gonna go to the next line by default. Because it goes to the next line in default, you can see this print statement actually going to the next line each time. That is, you can see each character printing in a separate line. And that's the whole idea of it. With this basic idea known, what we get to know and figure out here is that in our case, when you walk through this string, these 7 characters, character 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it's going to go through each one of them and it's going to print them. But that's not the only purpose or reason to use in. You can use in for a lot of purposes. For example, let's say you want to count the vowels in a string. For example, I'm just going to take this. Again, I would not want to take vowels because that would make me go through data structures immediately without us starting on it. So I would probably not take it up right away. We might take such examples ahead. But yeah, for our very basic understanding, let's just observe this. I can go through each character with an S1 just by using this for loop and printing that value. That should be good enough for me to go through every value of it. Moving ahead though, apart from for loop, apart from just this, there are a couple of other things that you need to know within for loop. Prior to this, I did not point out one important thing in if and else condition as a best practice. So let me just go back to that and walk around that once. Let me just go back to that quickly. Now let's just assume this. Let's just assume that, all right, that's totally all right, Jenny, if you're checking this out later. But yeah, getting back to this. A best practice that I would suggest highly when it comes down to if and else or conditional statements, think about this. Let's assume you have received a username and a password, and you need to authenticate it. Now, if you're going to have to authenticate a username and password at your end, there are a lot of ways you can do that. There are various ways that you can actually perform that. However, let's think about this to begin with. First, you need to check if username is not empty. Let's say we have some username and password as some strings. Let's say username is hello and password is world, just for our reference. First, we need to check if username is not empty and password is not empty or something like that. Some particular logic. Let's add it up. Again, I'm just showing you this so that we can understand a best practice when we work around this. Once we get to know they're both non-empty, the next thing for you to figure out is perform the next operation on top of them. It could be anything. Let's say check if that username exists. Let's say we write some logic, we write some line to check if username exists in the database. Some line we write, some line of code. Let's assume that we have written it. After that, if the username exists in the code, in the database, then whatever the database returns, if database return is equal to true or something like that. Let's say, for example, then let's just call db return equals true itself for reference. And one common thing you need to know whenever you're comparing with true and false, please don't use double equals. Instead, use is. This is a better way to compare with true and false because true and false are not numbers. They are different constructs. So it's always a better thing to just compare them in such a way that you get to know whether it is true or false by identifying is or not is in this case. Now, let's move ahead to the next case on this. So the next thing here is if database return is true, then again, you're going to check if um, password exists in the database. Here also, again, the same thing. Here you're going to check if, let's say, password return is true again. And I'm going to again check if password return is true. Then we're going to go ahead and perform, let's say, login. Instead of all of these, there's a better way to do this. You can see the amount of nested conditions that you're using here. One of the best practices by the best developers that I have worked with, they always suggest the more nested iterations that you use, the worse your code is. The worse your code is in terms of understanding, readability, and every other way. And I'm just going to explain why they say that and um, why that particularly makes sense. Right. So let's take a look at this. In our case, instead of checking all of this, you can write here if username, instead of checking if it is not empty, you can just check if username is empty and password is empty. Then you can just write this is invalid and you can return back to, let's say, the front end logic or user logic that this is invalid code. And I'm just going to use the keyword pass here to avoid empty loops or empty conditions. So pass is an inbuilt keyword that we have within Python. The idea of pass is if there is a condition and you don't want to do anything within that condition, you cannot leave that condition empty. You cannot leave it empty. To avoid leaving it empty, we just write pass instead. That's just a way for us to work around it for reference. Now, moving ahead from this, let's go on to the next part of this. Let's go on to the next case scenario. Now, the next one here is if these are empty, just ignore and exit. Now, the next thing is you check if whatever you perform, if they're not empty, then go ahead and check what is database returning if the username exists or not. Let's assume database returns true. In that case, again use if database return is false. Instead of is true, just check for the negative cases. If it is false, again return it is invalid username and just return false and exit from here. Let's see. Oh yeah, here there's you can see the reason why this is still showing an error is because this if condition has no lines in it. If there are no lines in it, just write pass. Temporarily, it'll make sure that if this condition is true, it does nothing. And then we'll then check. Now remember this, if the username is not empty or password is not empty, it'll go to this line. If the database returns true and it is not false, it'll continue to go here. If it is false, you can exit the logic right here. Then check again. If, let's say, for instance, the password return again is false, then just return saying invalid password. Otherwise, then go ahead and say this is valid and perform login. Now you can see how complicated this looks compared to how easier this might look. So there are a lot of these simple tips, tricks, and techniques that we look at to make sure that our code looks as least complicated as possible, just so that we get to see this, we get to observe this, and um, get to know and work around these best practices for our reference, just for our understanding. But yeah, anyway, let's move on from here. Let's move ahead to the um next logic from here. Now that we have understood and we have realized this basic idea and this basic logic on how this works, let's move on to the next part of this. Let's move on to the next case of this. The next case of this is moving on from a for loop. The next thing we have is another kind of loop called while. And yeah, before we go do that, there is one best practice I would like to specify about for loop as well that we use in reality often. But prior to doing that, I'm just going to take a few seconds to just go back to any queries if you might have. So if you have any queries so far, please feel free to let me know. I will walk through the same and I will answer your queries. If there are no queries, we can move ahead to the next part of it. All right. So no queries. That's pretty awesome. Thank you. So let's move ahead from this. Now, another thing that I would point out when we look at this particularly, when we um, look at the scenario of making sure that we have we are using for loops efficiently, is that think about this again. I'm only starting to work on this, so when we look at these constructs, I'm just specifying this so we can use these ideas ahead in time. So yeah, just for our reference, so let's take a look around. You can use it for various purposes. You can use it, you can use a for loop, let's say for character in string, or for some purpose, you can read or you can connect to a database. After connecting to a database, you might need to perform some operation. After performing some operation, you always need to close your database connection. Now, to close your database connection, let's say we have, I'm just giving you a rough idea of this because we are not connecting to our databases right now. I probably will do this in the coming sessions, either on day 2 or day 3, particularly Azure DB. Just to be clear with everybody before we go ahead, um, you particularly have access to Azure SQL databases. That is what you work on most of the time. Am I correct in assuming that?
I do more with on-premise myself, but that's just me. More on-premise SQL servers. We don't do much in Azure on our team.
All right. So in that case, Just to clarify and ask, would you prefer when we go ahead to our further sessions, that is day three, four, and so on, would you prefer us to work on connecting to SQL databases, either let's say on-premise or cloud-based with Azure? What would you prefer to particularly utilize? Because if it's on-premise, I can have a SQL database set up locally here in my PC, let's say for instance, to connect and utilize some randomly available data for some operation. Or if you particularly prefer to use Azure, I can set that up as well. So whatever your preference is based on your usage, I will work around it accordingly. So you can let me know based on the same. Right. So you can let me know by text as well. Just put it in the chat window. That should be fine because um, this will be done in the coming days, and um, yeah, it would help out in terms of whatever is your preferred method of operation with databases. We'll be doing the same code so that it'll help you on um, your operations as well. So yeah, anyway, prior to that, let's move ahead for now. Let's say we connect to a database and then we close the connection by disconnecting it. Now, this disconnect function should happen always, right? Now, this disconnect function should happen every time, regardless of what happens in a for loop. There might be a scenario where you might exit from a for loop prior. I'll just walk you through the conditions. So I think I'll walk you through a couple of examples so we understand why this is used in a better way. Now, since you should always execute disconnect, every time you connect to a database, you should always execute disconnect. It's best to write it at the last line of the for loop. But there's one problem. What if there's a condition here that during connection of the database or when you're connected to the database, let's say there's a problem, there's a scenario where the connection fails, or let's say there's a scenario where you have already received and you have completed the connection, you have worked around all the operations that you need, and you want to exit this loop directly or something like that. Or let's say connection, you do it prior to this or in this, however it might be, however the scenario might be. At this point of time, what if you exit this loop before disconnecting? Then you will never disconnect it and the connection will be kept active forever, right? Or at least for a long time until the timeout occurs. To avoid this, we generally use else after for loop and write our disconnect logic there. This is because you can use else after for loop. First thing, first and foremost, so we need to know. In Python, you can use else after for loop. You can use else after while loop as well. Now you might be wondering, why is there else after for loop or else after while loop? There's no if condition over there. It makes no sense. Absolutely true. However, think about this. Let's say we have a for loop for character in string. For each character in string, you perform some operation. The moment you reach a character, which is, let's say, question mark, you need to exit. Or the moment you encounter a character which is dot, you need to exit the loop. So what you end up doing here is at this point of time, for each character in S1, you walk through each character, you write a condition that is if character is, you can use is or you can use double equals. Better not to use is because its purpose is different, which I'll explain later on. If character is equal to a dot, then you need to exit the loop. To exit the loop, we have a simple statement called break. Break will exit the loop without executing it for the next characters. If I have, let's say, ABC dot DEF, For our reference, I'll take this exact example, Monday itself. Now I'm printing the character. I'm also going to add one condition. If character is equal to A, I'm going to execute break. What this means is it goes through each character, M, O, N, and then D. The moment it reaches A, since character is equal to A, break will exit the closest loop. The closest loop here is this for loop. So break will exit this for loop. The rest of the statements won't get printed. Break will just exit and you'll go out of the for loop. So if you run this, you'll get to print only MOND. Now, at this point of time, once this is done, whether you're exiting through break or whether you're exiting without a break, let's say if you need to perform some operation, let's say if you need to execute a statement or something like that, at the end, after you perform exit of the loop, or after you perform all the operations in the loop, let's say if you want to perform some additional operation like disconnecting the database or so on, you can write it within else. The idea of else is that no matter what happens within your for loop, whether it is gonna exit because of break statement or whether it'll naturally exit after all the characters are travels through, regardless of the scenario, else block will always execute. So if you have some statement ahead after the for loop here, which should execute, even though break executes, this one more line should execute after that. Since that won't execute here, you can write it in else and it will always execute. So the purpose of this is mainly to make sure that you can execute something regardless of the scenario. I'll give you one simple example. Oh, I am so sorry. One thing I forgot to say, one thing I forgot to point out. I think I made one minor mistake in what I pointed out. Else is executed when you exit the loop normally. I am so sorry, not regardless. Else logic, whatever you write here, this logic is executed only when your loop executes or exits normally. That is, uh, without encountering break. This is the whole idea. So if you encounter break, else logic will not execute. I'll give you a simple example to understand this. So this is for us to understand. I'm just going to give you an example of for and else example. Let's say I want to find out whether a string has z or not. There are better ways to do this. There is a much easier and better way to do this that can be done in a single line of code. We will do that. However, prior to doing that, let's take a look at this idea first. So let's take a string as something like this. I just want to find out whether it has the character Z in it or not. That's all we need to find out. So what I'm going to do here is for each character in the string S1, I'm going to go through each of that character. If character is Z, or sorry, let's not take is. If character is equal to Z, then you're just going to print something like Z found, and you're going to exit the loop because you don't need to check for further characters, right? Let's say there are further characters. The moment I find Z, that's it for me. I don't need to go through rest of the characters. Now, else will only execute when break does not happen, and break will not execute if Z is never found. That is when you can write here or print here Z not found. If you run this logic, it's going to print Z found. And after Z is found, it's going to break, which means it's going to exit the loop and exit the whole program. Otherwise, it goes to else. Now, for us to understand this logic, it's not going to be very easy for us to just walk through this and know how it works. So to understand how it works better, I'll just introduce you to the logic of debugging within Python. Let's just take a look at how you can debug within Python. If you take a look at this left-hand side, before the line number, you see the space where a red dot appears in whichever line you go. You can place red dots in all the lines that you want to track your code execution in. The whole idea of this is that your program will start running and your program will pause in these lines so that you can take a look at it when it is paused. You can observe what line is it running. You can observe what statement is it executing, what is the value of a variable, and then you can manually go to the next line for it to run. This is the advantage of debugging. So let's just take a look at it and we'll see how it works. For us to try it out, let's run the same thing. Oh, I'm so sorry. I need to debug it, not run it. So you can see in this next to this play button here, you have run and you have debug. I'm going to click on debug here, which is going to perform the debug operation. Once it debugs it, once it reaches this red point or what we call as breakpoint, it has stopped there and it has provided me with all the information of variables I have on the left side. So the character is A right now. This is S1. Character is A because of the previous case, just for our reference. It's not this A. We haven't started our loop yet. So this is where we have paused, and you can see this play bar here where you can continue executing one line at a time. Let's go to the next line. So first, the character has changed to uppercase A because that's the first character. Let's check if the character is Z or not. The moment you click continue, the next line is it goes back to the for loop because the character is not Z. Since character is not Z, the rest of the logic will not execute. It will go back to the loop and go to the next character. The next character is B. So if you run ahead, character changes to B. Again, same logic. Is it Z? No. So let's repeat with C. It's not Z. Then D, then E, then F. And when you go to the next step, character becomes Z. At this point of time, if char is equal to Z is checked. It is equal to Z. So it goes to the if condition. It prints Z. And once it prints Z, you're executing break, which means it exits the loop. When it exits the loop, it goes ahead to the next line. There's nothing here. That's the end of the program. That's why the rest of the code or else did not execute. So whenever you are struggling to take a look at the code and whenever you are struggling to walk through this, you can just take a look at this and try to understand this. And it helps out a lot to figure out where your code is going right, where your code is going right, wrong. Um, how your code is being executed, and so on. This is one thing that um, is highly beneficial in learning and working around this for our reference, just so we know. Anyway, that's about using else with a loop. You can also use else with while loop similarly. We have for loop. Similar to for loop, we have while loop and else here as well. So even in while loop, you can write some conditional statements and use else along with it. It'll only execute the else condition if break does not execute within while. That's another way to take a look at it and try to understand it as well. So you can see here, for example, we'll take a look at while loop ahead because let's start looking at more operators and data structures first so that we can actually understand while loop better. Right. So with this, let's now move ahead to the next part. Right. Moving ahead to the next part, before we go on to that, just one question prior to that. I usually tend to have a break for us prior to lunch and a small break after lunch. Since we have exactly 2 hours from now till the end of the session, would you like to have a small break now or sometime later on?
Now works.
All right, perfect. So let's have a break now, and let's just connect, let's say, 15 minutes ahead in time, and yeah, we'll continue ahead from there. So let's connect by 2:45 Eastern, if that is fine with everyone. All right. So we'll take a small break of 15 minutes. You can go have a little break, have a cup of coffee or whatever it could be. Yeah, I'm so sorry, I was on mute. So we'll join back by 2:45 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you.